If you watched my video last week, you know that one of my goals for 2023 was to release a YouTube video on this channel once per month. But another goal that I had was to read one book per month, just because I feel like I've never really been a great reader. And this seemed like an easy challenge just to get my feet wet and start a new habit. So I just figured I'd, share the books that I read, the 12 that I read this year, just in case any of you guys are trying to start a new habit but don't know where to start. The first book I read this year was The Lord of the Flies by William Golding. It's an absolute classic. It's one of my favorite books, so I figured this is as good a place to start as any. It follows a group of children stranded on an island, and they go absolutely crazy. It's just one of those classics, and I'd recommend the book as well as the movie for anyone just looking for an excellent story and characters. The second book I read this year was Night by Elie Wiesel. I hope I'm saying that right, but Elie Wiesel is a notable Holocaust survivor, and this book chronicles his experiences of being ripped from his home and moved between concentration camps. It's extremely heavy, and I think it's a very important read. Not only is it important to be aware of the atrocities that were forced upon the Jewish people by the Nazi Party during the early 1940s, but books like this one just serve as a good reminder that even when things aren't going well in our lives, we should be grateful that our struggles pale in comparison to the extreme suffering that the Jewish people felt during this time. And honestly, Wiesel finds a nice way of telling a beautiful story of survival in front of a backdrop of such powerful evils, and I think this book should be necessary reading for everybody. The third book I read this year was Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Like Lord of the Flies, I've always liked this book. I think I had to read it in middle school or something, so it felt right to go through it again. It's a sad and heartfelt story and a really quick read. Also, Steinbeck is a great author in general, so if you're looking for a new author to get into, this is your guy for sure. The fourth book I read this year was Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I think the author is technically anonymous. There's a couple authors that are listed. I'd have to look it up. Google just says Gawain Poet. I don't exactly know what that means, but I guess that's your guy. But if you're not familiar with it, they just released a movie recently about the Green Knight, and it is by far the shortest one on this list, but I kind of rationalize it by remembering that even if I only read this book for the year of 2023, that'd probably be more reading than I've done in the last 3 years combined. So also it's my challenge, so I can do whatever I want, so yeah. And then the fifth one was Animal Farm by George Orwell. I think I read part of it as a assignment in high school or middle school, and I never finished it, but I remember liking part of it, the part that I read, so I think it just made sense to go back. It's a great book. It's a classic. It's an allegory for the Russian Revolution of 1917, and it's just I don't know. It's one of those historical fictions that there's a lot to learn from it, and it's just a good book. I would read it if I were you. The sixth book I read was The Worst Hard Time by Timothy Egan. It was a gift from my uncle, and it is a look into the lives of those that lived through the Dust Bowl of 1930. I'm usually not really a nonfiction guy, but Egan writes it from the perspective of the people that went through it, and he makes it seem like they're characters in a larger story that is the natural disaster they were fighting to survive in. So I think it's a great read, definitely worth trying if you're interested in that time period, and especially if you're not normally a nonfiction fan. Like me, I find those books kind of boring, but like I said, Egan just has a great way of illustrating what's going on through the eyes of the people that lived it, so it's not really that bad. The seventh book I read was The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. Honestly, I just picked this one because I've always been interested in Hemingway. His life story is really sad, and at this point he's more of an enigma than anything. But I hadn't ever actually read anything from him, and when I like did a cursory glance on the internet, people were saying this is like a good book to start with, so I figured why not. Also, it's another short one, so it was just an easy pick. The 8th book I read was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. I'm sure everyone is very familiar with this story. I was just a fan of the movies and I never really read the books, so that's really all I'm going to say about that one. It's a good one. It's exactly like the movie. So the 9th book I read was Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. I read it on a recommendation from a friend of mine who's like a huge fan of Vonnegut, so he thought I'd be a fan of it. I wasn't a huge fan of it, mostly because of the way the story is non-linear. Not that that's like necessarily a bad thing, just in general, but I think I should probably reread it to really understand the characters and what's going on. I felt kind of lost for most of the story, and I got it mixed up in my head pretty bad, so I'll definitely have to take a look at it again in the future, like read it again. But it's definitely worth a read, and Vonnegut has a pretty good dry sense of humor, so if you're into that stuff, this is probably a good book to start on. The 10th book I read was How to Make Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. If you're not familiar with this book, it is usually regarded as like the grandpappy of self-help books. I've read a few self-help books and kind of liked them, so I figured this seems like people regard it as like a necessary reading in the self-help space, so I gave it a shot. I will say it's pretty underwhelming, at least for me. Most of this book could be summed up by the phrase, like, just be nice to people. Obviously, that's a huge simplification of some of the ideas in the book, but I think it's just been built up for so many years. I was kind of underwhelmed by the simplicity of it. But I'd say there's definitely some gem takeaways, though. Like, it's worth a read. It's just, like, not exactly what I thought it was going to be, so take that with a grain of salt. And then the 11th book I read was Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim by Robert C. O'Brien. I think I meant to read The Animals of Farthing Wood, and I got it like mixed up in my head. But honestly, I'm happy I landed on this book. It was a top tier book, and it has a great story. I think it was the first book I've ever felt like I couldn't put down. It is a children's book, so maybe that makes me a child, but I'm cool with it because this book was, like, honestly awesome, so I'll take it. The last book I read as part of this challenge was All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Maria Remarque. This was another recommendation by my buddy Kenny, and I love it. I should note that at the time I'm recording this, I have about 100 pages left because this video will come out on the 1st of January. And that's my deadline to read it, but I will add something later to add my final thoughts on it. It follows a group of soldiers that spend time in barracks and on the front lines in what I believe is World War I. I don't think it specifically says what war they're fighting, so I'd have to look it up to confirm. Yes, it is World War I. But so far, it's like a very honest and real look at the tragedy that is not only war in general, but specifically the atrocities that came in World War I, especially like the use of animals and like the gas and stuff, like just terrible shit. So it's an excellent look into it, and if you're a fan of war stories, this is probably the book for you. Editing Christian here. Can confirm the book is great. But yeah, that's the list. That's the 12 books I read for the year. I'm honestly pretty hyped that I stuck with it this long. And while it does feel good to have a more consistent reading habit, now that I've read like 12 this year, I think I'm probably good for like a couple years, so I don't think I'm going to read anymore.